At exactly 5 o'clock in the morning, when the world still sleeps and darkness covers the quiet streets of rural Arizona, an elderly woman named Dorothy Hayes woke up to a sound she would never forget. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a branch hitting her window. It was something heavy, something alive, banging on her wooden door with a rhythm that felt almost human. When she finally opened that door, her hands shaking, what she saw standing on her porch would change everything she thought she knew about memory, loyalty, and the invisible threads that connect all living creatures. This is not just a story about an animal showing up at someone's house. This is about a debt that nature never forgets. And when you hear what this little elephant came to do, you'll understand why some bonds are stronger than blood. Dorothy Hayes had lived alone in her small house on the outskirts of Tucson, Arizona, for nearly 12 years. Her husband had passed away long before. Her children had moved to different states chasing careers and dreams, and the only company she kept was the silence of the desert and the occasional visit from a neighbor who'd check if she needed groceries. Her home sat at the edge of where civilization met the wild, where the roads turned to dust and the land stretched endlessly toward horizons that seemed to have no end. It was a place where coyotes howled at night, where hawks circled overhead looking for their next meal, and where the line between human territory and nature's kingdom was thin, almost invisible. Dorothy liked it that way. She had always felt more at peace with animals than with people. People talked too much, judged too quickly, and forgot even faster. Animals, she believed, remembered everything. Every morning, Dorothy would wake before sunrise, make herself a cup of black coffee, and sit on her porch watching the desert come alive. She'd see rabbits darting between the cacti, roadrunners chasing lizards, and sometimes, if she was lucky, a family of javelinas passing through her yard like they owned the place. She never shooed them away. She never complained. To Dorothy, they were her neighbors, her community, the ones who never asked her why she lived alone or why she never remarried. They just existed alongside her, and that was enough. But on this particular morning, December 10th, something was different. The air felt heavier, thicker, like the world was holding its breath. And then she heard it. A low, deep thud against her front door. Once, twice, 3 times. Each knock was deliberate, patient, but insistent. Dorothy sat up in bed, her heart racing. She was 78 years old, and her mind immediately went to the worst possibilities. Was it someone trying to break in? Was it an intruder? She lived too far from town for the police to arrive quickly. She was on her own. Slowly, she reached for the flashlight she kept on her nightstand, her fingers trembling as she gripped it. The knocking continued. Thud, thud, thud. It wasn't frantic. It wasn't violent. It was almost polite, like whoever or whatever was out there was asking permission to enter. Dorothy wrapped herself in her old wool robe, the one her late husband had given her decades ago, and shuffled toward the front door. Her legs felt weak, her breathing shallow. She pressed her ear against the wood and listened. She could hear something breathing on the other side. Something big. When Dorothy finally unlocked the door and pulled it open, the first thing she saw was not what she expected. Standing on her porch, barely 3 feet tall, was a baby elephant. Its skin was wrinkled and dusty, its ears too big for its small head, and its trunk was raised slightly, as if waving hello. For a moment, Dorothy thought she was dreaming. She blinked. She rubbed her eyes. But the elephant was still there, staring at her with dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to carry a weight far beyond its young age. Dorothy had seen many things in her life, but never this. Never an elephant on her doorstep in the middle of the Arizona desert. Her first thought was that it had escaped from somewhere, maybe a zoo or a sanctuary. But the nearest facility like that was over 200 miles away. How could a baby elephant have traveled that far alone? The little elephant took a step forward, its massive feet making a soft thudding sound on the wooden porch. Dorothy instinctively stepped back, not out of fear, but out of sheer disbelief. The animal didn't charge. It didn't trumpet. It simply stood there, waiting, as if it expected her to recognize it. And then, in a moment that would haunt Dorothy for the rest of her days, the elephant lifted its trunk and gently touched her hand. The touch was warm, familiar, almost loving. It was the kind of touch you give to someone you've known your entire life, someone you've been searching for, someone you've missed. Dorothy felt a chill run down her spine. She looked into the elephant's eyes again, and this time, she saw something that made her knees go weak. She saw recognition. She saw memory. And suddenly, against all logic and reason, Dorothy understood. This elephant knew her. And somewhere deep in the corners of her own mind, buried beneath years of routines and loneliness, Dorothy realized she knew this elephant too. 15 years earlier, Dorothy Hayes had been a different woman. She had been younger, stronger, and most importantly, she had been a wildlife veterinarian. She had spent over 3 decades traveling across the United States, working with sanctuaries, rescue centers, and conservation programs dedicated to saving animals that had nowhere else to go. Her specialty had been large mammals, particularly elephants, creatures she had always believed were the most emotionally intelligent beings on the planet. Dorothy had seen elephants mourn their dead, protect their young with a ferocity that rivaled any mother in the animal kingdom, and remember the faces of humans who had helped them decades after their last encounter. She had always told people that elephants never forget, but most dismissed it as a myth, a cute saying with no real truth behind it. Dorothy knew better. She had witnessed it herself, time and time again. One of her most memorable assignments had been at a rescue center just outside of Phoenix, Arizona. The facility had taken in animals from all over the country, abused circus elephants, orphan calves whose mothers had been killed by poachers in other parts of the world, and elderly elephants who had been retired from zoos that could no longer care for them. It was there, in that dusty compound surrounded by desert heat and endless skies, that Dorothy first met a newborn elephant calf that had been rescued from a traveling circus. The calf had been born in captivity, separated from its mother within hours of birth, and was suffering from severe malnutrition and trauma. The staff had named the baby Covey, a name that meant wise in a language Dorothy couldn't quite remember. But wisdom was the last thing that little elephant had. All it had was fear, confusion, and a desperate need for someone to care. Dorothy volunteered to be Covey's primary caretaker. For 6 months, she spent nearly every waking hour with that elephant. She fed Covey from a bottle, mixed special formulas to help the calf gain weight, cleaned wounds that had been caused by chains and neglect, and most importantly, she talked to Covey. She told the little elephant stories, sang lullabies her own mother had sung to her as a child, and whispered promises that everything would be okay. At night, when the desert temperatures dropped and the stars filled the sky like diamonds scattered across black velvet, Dorothy would sit beside Covey's enclosure, her hand resting on the calf's side, feeling the rise and fall of its breathing. She had never had children of her own, and in those quiet moments, Covey became the closest thing she'd ever have to a daughter. The bond they formed was not just emotional. It was spiritual, something that transcended species, something that Dorothy believed was a gift from God himself, a reminder that love has no boundaries. But life, as it always does, moved forward. After 6 months, Covey had recovered. The elephant had gained weight, learned to trust again, and had been deemed healthy enough to be transferred to a larger sanctuary in California, a place with more space, more resources, and more elephants for Covey to bond with. Dorothy knew it was the right decision. She knew Covey deserved a life surrounded by others of its kind, a life where it could run free and experience what it meant to be an elephant. But saying goodbye was the hardest thing Dorothy had ever done. On the day Covey was loaded into the transport truck, Dorothy stood there with tears streaming down her face, her hand pressed against the metal bars as the little elephant reached out with its trunk one last time. Dorothy whispered, "Don't forget me, Covey. Please don't forget me." And then the truck drove away, disappearing into the horizon, taking with it a piece of Dorothy's heart that she never fully recovered. Years passed. Dorothy retired from veterinary work shortly after Covey left. Her body had grown tired. Her knees ached from decades of hard labor, and the emotional weight of constantly saying goodbye to animals she loved had finally broken her. She moved to the small house on the edge of Tucson, far from sanctuaries and rescue centers, far from the life she once knew. She convinced herself that it was better this way, that distance would help her heal. But the truth was, Dorothy never stopped thinking about the animals she had cared for, especially Covey. She wondered if the elephant was happy, if it had found a family, if it remembered the woman who had sat beside it every night singing songs that probably made no sense to anyone but them. Dorothy told herself that Covey had forgotten her, that animals moved on, that she was just another face in a long line of caretakers. But deep down, In the part of her heart she tried to ignore, Dorothy hoped she was wrong. Now, standing on her porch at 5 in the morning, face to face with a baby elephant that had somehow traveled across the desert to find her, Dorothy felt the weight of those years collapse. She dropped to her knees, her hands trembling as she reached out and touched the elephant's face. The skin was rough, warm, and impossibly real. This wasn't a hallucination. This wasn't a dream. This was happening. The elephant leaned into her touch, closing its eyes, and made a low rumbling sound that vibrated through Dorothy's entire body. It was a sound of comfort, of relief, of coming home. Dorothy's tears came fast and hard, spilling down her cheeks as she whispered, "Covey, is it really you?" The elephant responded by wrapping its trunk around Dorothy's arm, holding her gently, the way a child holds their mother's hand when they're scared. And in that moment, Dorothy knew. This was Covey. 15 years later, across hundreds of miles, through circumstances that defied all logic, Covey had found her. But how? That was the question that burned in Dorothy's mind as she sat on her porch with Covey beside her, the sun beginning to rise over the desert. How had this elephant not only remembered her, but also managed to find her way to this exact house in the middle of nowhere? Dorothy had moved after Covey had been transferred. She had changed her address, her phone number, everything. There was no trail to follow, no map that led from the sanctuary in California to this quiet corner of Arizona. And yet, here Covey was, as if guided by something beyond instinct, beyond reason. Dorothy thought about all the stories she had heard over the years, stories of elephants traveling hundreds of miles to return to places they had been as calves, stories of elephants mourning at the graves of humans who had been kind to them decades earlier. Scientists called it emotional intelligence. Dorothy called it something else. She called it love. She called it faith. She called it proof that God's creation was far more connected than humans ever gave it credit for. As the morning light grew stronger, Dorothy noticed something that made her heart sink. Covey was thin, too thin. The elephant's ribs were slightly visible beneath its skin, and there were scrapes and cuts on its legs, evidence of a long and difficult journey. Dorothy immediately went into caretaker mode. She rushed inside, grabbed every fruit and vegetable she had in her kitchen, apples, carrots, lettuce, bananas, and brought them out to Covey. The elephant ate slowly, carefully, as if savoring every bite. Dorothy filled a large bucket with water and watched as Covey drank deeply, the trunk pulling water up and spraying it into its mouth with a precision that had always amazed her. While Covey ate, Dorothy called the only person she could think of, an old colleague from her veterinary days named Marcus, who now worked with a wildlife rescue organization based in Flagstaff. When Marcus answered the phone and Dorothy explained the situation, there was a long silence on the other end. Finally, Marcus said, "Dorothy, that's impossible. Elephants don't just show up at people's houses." Dorothy looked at Covey, who was now lying down on her porch, exhausted but content, and replied, "Well, Marcus, you better come see this for yourself, because impossible or not, it's happening." Marcus arrived 3 hours later, and the look on his face when he saw Covey was one Dorothy would never forget. He stood there, mouth open, eyes wide, like he was witnessing something that shouldn't exist. Marcus examined Covey carefully, checking the elephant's teeth, eyes, and overall condition. After a while, he pulled Dorothy aside and said, "This elephant is around 15 years old, which matches the timeline of when you worked with that calf in Phoenix. And based on the markings and scars, I'd say this animal has traveled a long distance, possibly from California or even farther. Dorothy, I don't know how to explain this, but I think you're right. I think this is Covey." Dorothy felt her throat tighten. Hearing someone else confirm what her heart already knew made it real in a way that was almost overwhelming. Marcus continued, "We need to contact the sanctuary where Covey was transferred. We need to figure out how this happened and what we're going to do next." Dorothy nodded, but even as she agreed, a part of her already knew what was going to happen. Covey was going to have to leave again. Over the next few days, the story of Covey's journey began to unfold. The sanctuary in California reported that Covey had escaped 3 weeks earlier during a severe storm that had damaged part of the facility's fencing. By the time the staff realized Covey was missing, the elephant had already vanished into the wilderness. Search teams had been sent out, but after days of finding nothing, they had assumed the worst. They thought Covey had died, either from predators, starvation, or the harsh conditions of the wild. No one had imagined that the elephant had been traveling with a purpose, with a destination in mind. When the sanctuary officials heard that Covey had shown up at Dorothy's house over 200 miles away, they were stunned. One of the lead researchers, a woman named Dr. Evelyn Carter, called Dorothy personally and said, "In all my years studying elephants, I've never seen anything like this. Elephants have incredible memories, but this is beyond memory. This is something else entirely." Dr. Carter explained that elephants use a combination of spatial memory, social bonds, and even infrasound communication that humans can't hear to navigate vast distances. But even with all that knowledge, no one could fully explain how Covey had found Dorothy after so many years and across such an impossible distance. Where are you watching this video from? Spain, Mexico, Chile, the United States, or somewhere I can't imagine? Tell me in the comments. I want to know where this story resonates with you. Because what happened next is something that people from every corner of the world need to hear. The sanctuary officials gave Dorothy two options. They could send a team to retrieve Covey and bring the elephant back to California, where it would live out the rest of its life in safety and comfort. Or, if Dorothy was willing, she could become Covey's legal guardian, allowing the elephant to stay with her under the condition that Dorothy would work with the sanctuary to ensure Covey's needs were met. It was an almost unheard of arrangement, but given the extraordinary circumstances, the sanctuary was willing to make an exception. Dorothy didn't hesitate. She looked at Covey, who had barely left her side since arriving, and said, "This elephant traveled across the desert to find me. I'm not sending her away again." And just like that, Dorothy Hayes, a 78-year-old retired veterinarian living alone in the Arizona wilderness, became the guardian of the elephant who refused to forget her. The months that followed were unlike anything Dorothy had ever experienced. With the help of the sanctuary, she transformed her property into a safe haven for Covey. They built a large enclosure with access to shade, water, and plenty of space for the elephant to roam. Dorothy spent her days preparing meals, monitoring Covey's health, and simply being present. Neighbors who had once rarely seen Dorothy now watched in awe as she walked through her yard with a full-grown elephant following her like a shadow. Some thought she was crazy. Others thought she was blessed. Dorothy didn't care what anyone thought. All she knew was that Covey had chosen her, and she was going to honor that choice for as long as she lived. In the wild, territory is power. The one who controls the land controls everything. But in this story, power wasn't about dominance. It was about loyalty. It was about a bond that couldn't be broken by time, distance, or logic. As the seasons changed, Dorothy began to notice something remarkable. Covey wasn't just surviving. She was thriving. The elephant had gained weight, her energy had returned, and there was a lightness in her movements that hadn't been there when she first arrived. But more than that, Covey seemed at peace. Every evening, as the sun set over the desert and the sky turned shades of orange and pink, Covey would stand beside Dorothy's porch, her trunk resting gently on the railing, and they would watch the world together in silence. Dorothy would talk to Covey the way she used to, telling her about her day, sharing memories of her late husband, and sometimes just sitting there, feeling the quiet comfort of not being alone anymore. It was in those moments that Dorothy understood something profound. In the wild, survival is the greatest treasure. Every day you wake up is a victory. But for Dorothy and Covey, survival wasn't enough. They needed each other. And that, Dorothy believed, was God's way of reminding her that no one is ever truly alone. One evening, about 6 months after Covey's arrival, Dorothy received a visit from Dr. Evelyn Carter, the researcher from the sanctuary. Dr. Carter had come to check on Covey's progress, but she also had something else on her mind. As they sat on Dorothy's porch, watching Covey graze in the distance, Dr. Carter said, "Dorothy, I've been studying elephants for over 20 years, and I still don't fully understand what happened here. The odds of Covey not only remembering you, but also finding you after all this time are so small that they're almost non-existent. Some of my colleagues think it was pure luck, a fluke of nature. But I don't believe that. I think Covey's journey is proof of something we've been trying to explain for decades. Elephants don't just remember events. They remember emotions. They remember how someone made them feel. And when you cared for Covey all those years ago, you didn't just save her life. You gave her something to hold on to. Something that stayed with her even when everything else in her world changed." Dr. Carter paused, her eyes misting over, and then she said, "You gave her love. And love, Dorothy, is the most powerful force in nature. It's stronger than instinct. It's stronger than survival. It's the one thing that can guide a lost soul across impossible distances and bring them home." Dorothy felt tears welling up in her eyes as she listened to Dr. Carter's words. For so many years, she had believed that her work with animals had been just that, work. She had never thought of herself as someone who made a lasting impact, someone who changed lives in a way that mattered. But sitting there, with Covey nearby and the desert stretching endlessly around them, Dorothy realized that she had been wrong. Every animal she had cared for, every wound she had healed, every frightened creature she had comforted, they had all mattered. And Covey's journey was proof of that. It was proof that kindness is never wasted, that compassion leaves a mark that time cannot erase, and that love, real love, has the power to defy every rule the world tries to impose. Dorothy looked at Dr. Carter and said, "I used to think I saved Covey, but the truth is, she saved me. When my husband died, when my children moved away, I felt like I had nothing left to give. I felt like my purpose was over. But Covey reminded me that as long as you're breathing, you still have something to offer. You still have love to give." As the years passed, Dorothy and Covey became something of a local legend. News outlets picked up the story, and people from all over the country reached out to Dorothy, sharing their own experiences with animals, their own stories of unexpected connections and bonds that couldn't be explained. Dorothy never sought the attention, but she appreciated the reminder that she wasn't alone in believing that animals were far more than the world gave them credit for. She received letters from children who wanted to become veterinarians, from elderly people who had also lost their spouses and found comfort in the companionship of animals, and from scientists who wanted to study Covey's case further. Dorothy politely declined most of the offers, preferring to keep her life with Covey as private as possible. This wasn't about fame or recognition. This was about honoring a promise she had made 15 years ago when she whispered to a baby elephant, "Don't forget me." And Covey hadn't. Against all odds, Covey had remembered. In the wild, the greatest riches aren't found in gold or glory. They're found in the moments that take your breath away, the connections that remind you why you're alive, and the loyalty that transcends every boundary. For Dorothy, Covey was her greatest treasure. And for Covey, Dorothy was home. There's a saying that elephants never forget, and for most of Dorothy's life, she had believed it was just a comforting thought, a way to make humans feel better about the animals they loved. But now, she knew it was more than that. It was a truth, a law of nature that proved love is eternal, that bonds forged in compassion cannot be broken, and that sometimes, against all logic and reason, the universe conspires to bring two souls back together. Dorothy often thought about what would have happened if she hadn't opened that door at 5 in the morning. What if she had been too scared? What if she had called the authorities first and never looked Covey in the eyes? She would have missed this. She would have missed the most important chapter of her life. Every night, before Dorothy went to bed, she would walk out to Covey's enclosure one last time. She would rest her hand on Covey's side, feeling the warmth of the elephant's skin, the steady rhythm of her breathing, and she would say a prayer. She thanked God for giving her this second chance, for reminding her that her life still had meaning, and for proving that love, real love, never dies. And Covey, in her own way, would respond, wrapping her trunk gently around Dorothy's arm, holding her close, as if to say, "I'm here. I'll always be here." In a world that often felt cold, cruel, and indifferent, Dorothy and Covey had found something rare. They had found each other, and that, more than anything else, was worth more than all the riches the world could offer. The story of Dorothy and Covey is not just about an elephant who remembered a woman who cared for her. It's about the power of faith, the resilience of love, and the undeniable truth that we are all connected in ways we cannot always see or understand. Dorothy Hayes could have lived out the rest of her days in quiet solitude, convinced that her purpose had passed. But God had other plans. He sent Covey back to her, not as a coincidence, not as a random act of nature, but as a reminder that every act of kindness, every moment of compassion, every whispered promise made in the dark, they all matter. They all leave a mark. And sometimes, when you least expect it, that mark comes back to find you. Today, Dorothy is 80 years old, and Covey is still by her side. They have become inseparable, two souls who defied the odds and found their way back to each other. When people ask Dorothy how she explains what happened, she simply smiles and says, "I don't try to explain it. I just thank God for it." And maybe that's the lesson here. Maybe we're not supposed to understand everything. Maybe some things are meant to be felt, not analyzed. Maybe the greatest truths in life are the ones that can't be measured or proven, the ones that exist in the space between logic and faith, the ones that remind us that we are never truly alone. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of a bond you once had, a connection you thought was lost, or a love you still carry, then leave a comment below. Tell me what this story means to you. Tell me if you've ever experienced something that defied explanation, something that made you believe in the impossible. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because there are more stories like this one, stories that will move you, challenge you, and remind you why life is worth living. Hit that like button if you believe that love is the most powerful force in the universe, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Because in a world that often forgets, we need more stories that remind us to remember. Thank you for staying with us until the end. If this story touched your heart, please consider supporting us by looking for the thanks button with the heart icon below the video so we can continue sharing more moving stories. See you in the next story.